Right. Yeah, the talks today are a little different from, or the sequence is a little different from what has been scheduled. Just to recapitulate a little, yesterday I started off by giving a brief introduction to what cognitive linguistics is and some important themes in cognitive linguistics. Then in the afternoon I addressed the question of categorization, doing prototypes and basic levels. And there's actually a portion of the stuff I had prepared for yesterday which I'll bring in today, as it has to do to some extent with the relation between words and syntactic constructions. Okay, another point, I think it might be a good idea, it would be a good idea if we set aside some time, perhaps this afternoon, half an hour or so, for questions and discussions and some sort of interactive activities. So if you have any questions or if you want to make any statements, critical or whatever, perhaps we can arrange that this afternoon for half an hour, 45 minutes, or whatever. So there'll have to be some arrangement for microphones being distributed around here. So if you have some questions or want to raise any issues, then think about it, prepare your questions or your statements, and then we'll do that this afternoon. Okay? Right. What I want to talk about today is the question of rules. As we all know, when learning a language, you have to learn the rules. Grammar books consist of rules. Now, I suppose the question of rules in now, rules, I suppose, in language teaching have a somewhat controversial statement, controversial status. Okay. It's perhaps generally recognized that to teach your learners the rules of the language actually is very much a waste of time, that knowing the rule is no guarantee for being able to speak correctly. One reason for that actually could very well be not because it's wrong to give rules, but perhaps because the rules are wrong. Quite clearly, if you give people wrong rules, then they're not going to be much use. And I mention this because cognitive grammar, cognitive linguistics, has a rather different approach to rules from the one that we are basically familiar with. And what I want to do this morning is to discuss the cognitive linguistic approach to rules. What are they? And and perhaps to show that rules actually, if rules are understood properly, they might actually have some place within for language teachers and course writers and such like. Okay, let's start with the traditional view. Well, I say traditional, it's traditional for me. I don't know whether it's traditional for you. It's traditional in the sense that, this is the tradition of certainly Western grammar books, linguistics, well, certainly academic linguistics, even up to now. And, of course, this is the basis of Chomskyan theoretical linguistics. The idea would be that a language, describing a language consists, a description of a language consists of two parts. There is the lexicon and there is the syntax. If you like, the dictionary and the grammar book. So the idea would be, if you learn a language, you need two handbooks, two reference books. One reference book is a dictionary, and the other reference book is grammar book. Right? Dictionary plus grammar book. So the lexicon, well, the dictionary. Lexicon is a fancy word that linguists use. But the dictionary, lexicon, lists the words of the language. Okay? And the syntax, the grammar book, lists the rules for how the words can be combined into phrases and into sentences. So the idea is that, as I say, to know a language or to study a language, you need these two handbooks. Now, and the reason for this distinction is reasons for this distinction can be found in many places. This is a quotation from a recent book by a leading American linguist called Ray Jackendorf, his book Foundations of Language 2002. And this is a pretty standard statement of why you need a dictionary and a grammar book. Okay. This is pretty standard stuff. So since the number of possible utterances in the human language is unlimited, so the number of things you can say in a language is unlimited, there's no fixed number of things you can say, language users cannot store them all in their heads. So because the number of things that you can say is unlimited, it's not possible to learn them all beforehand. Right? So you can't learn everything, every sentence that exists in the language. Right? That's obvious. So you don't store all these possible utterances in your head. That's impossible. Not just because your memory isn't big enough, but in principle it's not possible because the number is not fixed. It is unlimited, infinite. Okay, so what do you store in your head then? Rather, he goes on, knowledge of language requires two components. And here you have one is a finite list of structural elements that are available to be combined. Okay. The finite, the fixed number, list of elements that can be combined. This list is traditionally called the lexicon, and its elements are called lexical items. Words, if you like. But not just words, it would also include morphemes and bits of words, and perhaps certain fixed idioms possibly as well. Okay, this is the lexical items, the lexicon. The other component is a finite set of combinatorial principles or a grammar. Again, the finite set is a list of rules, a fixed number of rules, of principles for combining things, and this is called the grammar, okay? And that's it. Now, another statement, actually, from another recent publication. This is from a book which tries to present modern theoretical linguistics in a kind of way that's available to the general reader, but hence it's a rather informal, chatty kind of approach. So suppose someone were to ask you what English is. What is English? You might say that English is a set of sentences that are constructed by combining the following ingredients. Ingredients is a funny word here. It suggests a kind of cooking metaphor, right? You bake your cake by mixing the ingredients. So the ingredients of sentences are, so the ingredients, and you hand your listener a massive dictionary that lists all the English words. So these are the ingredients according to the following rules of grammar. This is the recipe. And you hand her an equally massive English grammar. And between them, these two books would tell the reader how to make any conceivable English sentence. Okay, it could hardly be put clearer than that. Right? So this is what I suggest is a kind of standard, traditional view, certainly amongst academic linguists and amongst the Chomskyians and so on. And from one point of view, it makes perfectly good sense because, as pointed out, it is not possible to learn every sentence of a language. So you've got to have some means of making sentences, constructing them, and reasonable approach would be to say there are the ingredients and there are the ways for combining the ingredients. Okay, that is, as I say, the sort of standard view. Now, if we take the standard view and if we sort of pursue it, certain things follow from it. So an entailment. Now, entailment is a word which is used in logic very often. One statement entails, so A entails B. If A is true, B also has to be true. So an entailment is a kind of logical relation. If you accept this, you must accept that. Something that follows logically. It's a logical requirement. Now, the standard view, the dictionary plus the grammar book, has certain entailments. If you have this model of language, then certain things follow. The first is that, what do the rules do? The rules combine words, but they don't combine words as such. The rules do not refer to words as such. So you don't have a rule for the word, for how to use the word dog and how to use the word horse and how to use the word tree. What you have is a rule for how to use nouns, for example. So the rules do not refer to words as such, but they refer to categories of words. Going back to the categories we had yesterday. So you have the categories of determiners, the categories of adjectives, the category of noun, and combine them in a certain way, and you get the category of a noun phrase. So this is the nature of the rules. They refer to grammatical categories. This means, an entailment, that the words in your dictionary have got to be labeled according to their grammatical category. They've got to be labeled as noun, verb, and so on. Because it's these categories that the rules refer to. Right? So a noun phrase would consist of determiner plus noun, let us say, or determiner adjective plus noun. It also follows that each member of a grammatical category, each member of the noun category, let us say, behaves the same with respect to the rules. So all nouns are the same with respect to the rules. Another way of putting that is to say that the rules apply across the board to everything that meets their description without exception. You think of the analogy perhaps with sort of algebra, if you have, if you have x plus y squared equals whatever it equals. Think of a formula in algebra using x and y. The formula would apply no matter what value you give to x and y. So x and y would be variables which can take any value, and the statement would be correct irrespective of the values you give to x and y. So here the rules of grammar work on the categories of noun, verb, adjective, and so on. It doesn't matter what value they have, what particular lexical items are fitted in there. But, as we all know, once you start looking at rules, find exceptions. And as I put at the bottom here, at a sufficiently detailed, sophisticated level of analysis, actually many words turn out to have unique syntactic properties, and even the most general rules are general only to a degree. In other words, all rules have exceptions, which means, in fact, that they are not rules if they have exceptions. Right? So there's something wrong with the rule if it has exceptions, basically. Now, what is wrong with this? Okay, I'll go through this point fairly quickly. If you're not into theoretical syntax, doesn't matter. Okay, one problem with the dictionary plus grammar book model. Sorry, there's a B missing there. One problem with this is that by applying the rules, the grammar over-generates. It produces far too many things. In other words, not every combination of determiner, adjective, noun is an acceptable noun phrase. Not every combination of noun phrase, verb, noun phrase is an acceptable clause, etc., etc. And as we know, or if you've done theoretical syntax, you'll know all sorts of devices are used to rescue the theory, selectional restrictions, subcategorizations, etc., etc. Well, I won't go into that at the moment. Another problem with the dictionary plus grammar book model is that it entails, well, first of all, it entails that complex expressions consisting of more than one word, are actually generated, are actually composed, created, as and when you require them. You don't actually learn expressions. So you learn the words, you don't learn phrases. Okay? And the second point is that the model entails that complex expressions are compositional. And compositionality, this means, again, a technical term in, I suppose, logical semantics, that the whole, the properties of the whole can be predicted from the properties of the parts and the way in which they are combined. So if you know the parts, you know the properties of the whole. Okay? So the meaning of the whole can be worked out on the basis of the meanings of the parts and the way in which they are combined. Now, a problem with that is that when you combine words, the meaning of the whole very often, well, it can be predicted to some extent, but there are problems. If you take, for example, the word heavy, now heavy would mean referring to weight, okay? But then you have an expression like, okay, so a heavy box, the meaning of heavy box is compositional, okay, you can say. You know what a box is, you know what heavy means, put them together, a heavy box means a box that's heavy, okay? But then you have an expression like a heavy drinker. If you're a heavy drinker, this means not that you weigh 100 kilos, but it could. That would be the compositional meaning. A heavy drinker would be somebody who drinks far too much, who drinks alcohol far too much, not that you drink tea too much. So a heavy drinker would be somebody who drinks a lot of alcohol. Now, is the meaning of heavy drinker compositional? Well, you have a heavy smoker. A heavy smoker would be somebody who smokes too much. So there is a sense of heavy which means that you do something too much. But the problem, so you can say, if you have heavy meaning to do something which you shouldn't really do, too much, so to do something in excess so that it's bad for you, because there's nothing wrong with having a beer occasionally. So drinking in itself is not wrong, but if you do it too much of it, then it becomes bad. So to do something to excess. And you can say that is one of the meaning of heavy. If you take that, then heavy drinker, heavy smoker would be compositional. But then what about a heavy eater? You can eat too much, you can eat to excess. The problem there is that heavy eater is not actually an expression. It doesn't make sense in English, a heavy eater. You would say an excessive eater, or you eat too much. Other examples, you could have a heavy gambler. To gamble, you know, and I think you could say a heavy gambler, somebody who gambles too much. So, you see the problem. In order to preserve compositionality, in order to make out that heavy drinker is compositional, the word heavy has to be associated with two meanings, at least two meanings. One meaning to weight, the other meaning do something to excess. And only one of which is selected in the compositional process. In other words, you've got to say that the word heavy has a list of meanings, in this case two, for example. But even this, you see, it's not a fully productive rule because a heavy eater doesn't work. What about heavy sleeper? A heavy sleeper. Well, that exists. You can say a heavy sleeper, but it means something different. A heavy sleeper is simply somebody who, when he's asleep, it's very difficult to wake him up. So, a deep sleeper, if you like. It doesn't mean somebody who sleeps too much. So heavy in that case, that sense has a slightly different sense. So you see, the compositionality principle, which says that the meaning of the whole can be worked out on the basis of the meanings of the parts and the way they are combined, although that looks pretty straightforward, pretty obvious, once you start looking at examples, you find that all sorts of problems, actually. And the points and the problems are that, okay, full compositionality is probably the exception rather than the rule. Now, for that, no, we don't have a projector. I wanted to illustrate that on something, but we'll take Lanneker's example of that. If you've read Lanneker's cognitive grammar books, you may remember his discussion of the sentence, of the expression, the football under the table. The football under the table. Now, if you visualize that, what situation does that describe? Well, you have the table and you have the football. That's how you would imagine it. Is that what the expression actually says? Well, yes and no. The expression, the football under the table, simply says the football is at a place which is lower than the place of the table. Now, you can have all sorts of configuration of table and football, which are different. Perhaps the table is suspended from the ceiling, and there is the football underneath it. That is the football under the table, but that is not how you would interpret it. Okay? Or perhaps you have a room full of old junk, old furniture, and there's the table upside down, and there's the football squashed underneath it. But that's not how you would normally interpret the football under the table. The point is, when you interpret the football is under the table, and the football under the table, you would actually go beyond compositionality. You would enrich the interpretation, right? You would add to it, add details to it, which are actually not in the expression itself. So full compositionality is probably the exception, not the rule. So there are problems with compositionality. It's almost as if expressions or sentences and so on do not actually, encode the precise meaning. What they do, they give you hints as to how something can be interpreted. Okay? And the second problem, which we'll come back to actually subsequently, the dictionary plus grammar book model entails compositionality, which entails very often polysemy. That is, words are polysemous, they have more than one sense. But then once you start looking at polysemy, it's often very, very difficult to actually decide even such a basic question as how many different meanings a word has, for example. And we'll come back to that later. Now, one of the major problems with this dictionary and grammar book thing is that it actually fails to recognize what is a very, very important characteristic of any language, and that is the idiomaticity of it, the idioms. And I want to spend some time talking about idioms and characteristics of idioms. Now, what is an idiom? Well, there are different ways of understanding the expression idiom and idiomatic. Some people would restrict idiom to things like kick the bucket and it's raining cats and dogs. Okay, some people would restrict the word idiom to that. What I want to do is to have a much broader, a much wider definition of idiom. And a good way of describing idioms is an idiom is anything that cannot be predicted by the dictionary plus grammar book, basically. An idiom is anything that cannot be predicted from the dictionary plus grammar book. So from this point of view, a heavy drinker is an idiom, right? Because given a meaning of heavy, you can't work out what it means. Of course, you could fix that by saying, well, heavy does have a meaning, do something to excess, but then you have the problem with your heavy eater, which doesn't exist, right? Other things, what a heavy worrier. Can you have a person who worries too much? No. Heavy worrier doesn't work. So this is the idiomatic. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You can't predict on the basis of your dictionary plus grammar. Now, as we know, anybody who learns a foreign language or whatever, languages are idiomatic, and this is what makes them difficult and interesting. Actually, there's another meaning of idiom. If you look up idiom, I think it's the I think it's the Collins dictionary. I can't quite remember. One of the standard English dictionaries gives two definitions of idiomatic, of idiom and idiomatic. One definition is expressions like "it's raining cats and dogs." The other definition of idiomatic is to speak fluently like a native speaker. Right? To speak idiomatic English, that doesn't mean to use expressions like raining cats and dogs all the time, but it means to speak English fluently as a native speaker. So that's another definition of idiomatic. And in a way, these two definitions are actually very similar, actually, as we'll show. Okay, so the idiomatic. This is what is ignored by the dictionary plus grammar book. Now, there are lots of different things that fall under idiomatic. And here I've listed some of the things that fall under idioms, and then we'll look at some of the these categories a bit later. Now, when you think of idioms, most people actually think of the first category, expressions whose syntax is normal, but whose meaning is unpredictable. And the standard example is kick the bucket, as you all know the expression. Okay. It's not very common, actually. It is not in common use, but kick the bucket means to die. To die, usually unexpected, to die, no, not unexpectedly. To die of natural causes. You don't kick the bucket in an accident. You can't say had a car crash and kicked the bucket. No, but you would say an old person, oh, he finally kicked the bucket, right? The origin of that expression is very obscure, but I won't go into that. Okay, so kick the bucket can be interpreted two ways. One, you kick the bucket with your foot, or to die. And another one, I don't know whether you know this one, to spill the beans. Do you know this one? Yes, you have a secret, and you spill the beans, you reveal the secret. You have confidential, private information, and you tell everybody about it. Okay? So to spill the beans, to say things you shouldn't really say, because they're private, confidential. Okay, and again, spill the beans, it's a perfectly normal verb phrase. You can interpret it literally, compositionally, but it also has the idiomatic meaning as well. Okay, that's the first category, and there are. Do I talk about these? Yeah. And yeah, okay. Here are some more examples. You may well be familiar with these. These are, again, normal expressions, syntactically normal. They have a normal literal interpretation and the idiomatic interpretation. Notice that they are often not so much metaphorical, but they often are associated with a quite special visual image. Right, like spilling the beans, you can imagine the pot of beans and you spill them. Or let the cat out of the bag. Do you know that one? Okay. Again, it's a very specific visual image. You have a bag, there's a cat in it, and the cat gets out. Okay. And that means, once again, to reveal the secrets. You have confidential information, and then it becomes public. To pull someone's leg, to tease someone, to make fun of someone. The buck stops here, meaning I am responsible finally. Right? There's some confusion, there's some crisis, some disaster. Who is responsible? Where does the buck stop? A red herring. You know a red herring? A red herring, that's a piece of information which is completely irrelevant. So you're having a discussion, and what you say, that's a red herring. It's not relevant to the discussion. A black box, well, a box which is black, but also airplanes have a black box, and the black box is the flight recorder. So after the accident, you look for the black box to see what's happened. To add fuel to the flames, there's a fire, so you pour petrol on it, and the fire becomes... And this means there is an argument going on, people are disagreeing. If you add fuel to the flames, you simply make the argument, you say things which makes the argument even worse. To take the bull by the horns... do you know that one? No? Well, okay, the bull, a dangerous animal. How do you control the bull? Well, you get hold of it by the horns. In other words, it's a difficult situation, and how do you deal with a difficult situation? Well, you attack it right in the center. You don't play around, you go right to the problem. And finally, to paint the town red, that means to go out and have a good time. And get... there are dozens and dozens of these. Notice that they're all rather colorful. They invoke some sort of image, visual image. They're sort of metaphorical, but special kinds of metaphors, but we won't go into that. So these are then the phrasal idioms, which have a non-compositional semantics, that is what makes them idioms, yet the syntax is normal. And they can be interpreted either idiomatically or literally. When I say these are metaphorical, because if you take the expression spill the beans, reveal the information, you can see the metaphor there. The beans are in a container, right? The beans are the information. The container is your private mind. You spill the beans become public. Right? They get out. Likewise, let the cat out of the bag. The bag, the cat is the secret. The bag contains the secret. But notice, you can see these are sort of metaphorical, but notice that the metaphors are not productive. You can't let, the dog out of the kennel. Well, you can, but it doesn't mean to reveal the secret. You can't let the bird out of the cage. Well, you can, literally, but it wouldn't mean reveal the information. In other words, there's no sort of productive metaphor there. But never mind. Okay, let's go back. So first of all, you have the things with the unpredictable semantics. Then the second category, which is sort of the opposite of these are expressions whose syntax is odd, whose syntax is very peculiar. For example, you have the expression by and large. I agree with you by and large, more or less, 50, 60%. Now, by and large, by is a preposition, right? Large is an adjective, and coordinates. But you can't, in general, coordinate a preposition and an adjective. Right? So you can't have sort of up and small, or in and great. Yes. So there's no rule, there's no syntactic rule for creating by and large by putting a preposition plus adjective. Right? So it's the syntax that's funny. There's no metaphor, there's no visual image here. There's no compositional meaning because there is no syntax actually. Likewise, in short, in is a preposition, short is an adjective. You can't normally combine prepositions with adjectives. You have in short, but you can't say in large, in big, right? In long, doesn't work. Okay. Now, do we have any more of these? Yeah, here are a couple more of them. There aren't, well, maybe there are. Okay, by and large, in short, another one, far be it from me to criticize. Okay, far be it from me, which is usually used rather sarcastically. I don't want to criticize you, but, so far be it from me to criticize. It is not my habit to criticize. However, I'm going to. And it was far be it from me. Notice the very peculiar syntax. The be, it's a sort of, what is it, an imperative? I don't know. Anyway, the far be it from me is a fixed thing. And then, of course, you have the once upon a time, which begins your fairy. You would normally think of the idiomatic, but the conventional way to say things. In other words, if you want to know what somebody's name is, what do you ask? Well, you could say, what's your name? Or you could say, what are you called? Both are correct. Both are grammatically correct. Nothing wrong with either of them. Both mean what you want them to mean. However, one of these is the normal way of asking the question, and the other one is not the normal question, the normal way. The normal way to ask in English would be, what's your name? So that's the normal way of asking the question. So what are you called is not wrong. It's grammatically perfectly correct, but that's not the way to ask the question. It is unidiomatic in this sense. Likewise, you would say, what is your age, or how old are you? Well, how old are you is the normal way of asking. What is your age? Again, there's nothing wrong with it, but that's not the normal way to ask the question. So to this extent, they are sort of idiomatic, right? Then you have the whole category of fixed phrases and cliches. Things like, oh, I wouldn't do that if I were you. I wouldn't do that if I were you, which is a perfectly normal expression. The syntax is perfectly normal. The meaning is perfectly normal. But I would imagine every native English speaker knows the expression and has learnt it as a whole. It's a fixed phrase. You advise somebody against doing something. Well, I wouldn't if I were you. Don't do it. One piece of evidence for that is that if you replace the I with different pronouns, she wouldn't do that if she were you. Makes perfectly good sense, but that's not idiomatic. You don't say that. So, I say, I wouldn't do that if I were you is predictable. It's nothing idiomatic in the syntax. The meaning is perfectly regular, and yet it's something that I would think every English speaker would know as a unit. Another one, tell me about it. Well, tell me about it. What is idiomatic about that? Well, in fact, it is used in a sort of idiomatic sense. So somebody says, I don't know, these linguistics lectures are terribly boring. Tell me about it. Meaning, I agree. In fact, don't tell me about it because I know. So tell me about it is a expression which has to have actually the appropriate intonation, actually. Tell me about it. I know. It's all, yeah. Catchphrases, quotations, allusions. I think I have something on that later. Oh yeah, here's some more of these fixed expressions now. Oh, okay. Fixed expressions, you've got to be joking. Which again is a fixed expression, meaning you can't be serious, you've got to be joking. Then you have quotations, allusions, to be or not to be, Shakespearean quotation. And these quotations have sort of entered the language, right? And the expression, a day in the life of, that refers to the title of a novel, I think, isn't it? A day in the life of. And this, it occurs in, book titles, newspaper, headings, and so on. Cliches like, the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. Do you know that one? Well, okay, you're at the top of the cliff, you have an accident and you fall off the cliff. And then the ambulance arrives at the bottom of the cliff. In other words, help is sent too late. You deal with the problem after it happens, rather than dealing with the problem before it happens. So the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, a very common expression nowadays, to deal with the problem when it's too late, right? To deal with the accident after it rather than preventing it. And do you know making hay? Make hay while the sun shines. Okay, and make hay, that is used very often without mention of the whole proverb. Simply, to make hay is to take advantage of the situation before it changes. Okay. Okay, there are thousands of these things. Another category, formulas. Formulaic expressions which often have a special function in interpersonal or the structuring of discourse. Okay, you make a list of points, first, second, third, fourth, last, and last but not least. Okay, if you make a list of things, last but not least, the final point, but that doesn't mean it's unimportant. So you make a list of points, first, second, third, and last but not least. It comes at the end, but it's still important. And then, in the first place, on the other hand, the thing is, I want to say this, what's more, would you mind doing this? And so on. So, where are we? So, there are fixed phrases, cliches, catchphrases, quotations, allusions. Yeah, another very important category here are collocations. Do you know collocations? A collocation basically is the way in which if two words are associated. So, two words collocate if they tend to occur together. For example, take the word unmitigated. I don't know whether you know the word unmitigated, but it occurs nearly always with disaster. An unmitigated disaster is a complete disaster with no good points. So give the word unmitigated disaster. The foreseeable future. Right? So for foreseeable future go together. Right? If you want to test that out actually to see whether what I say is true or not, one resource to use here would be a corpus, which I mentioned yesterday, in fact. I'll come back to that later today. Check out these things in the British National Corpus. Or another good way to find out about collocations is to Google, in fact, to use a search engine. Put in the word unmitigated into Google. You'll get tens of thousands of hits. But just take the first 20 or 30 and see which nouns the words unmitigated occur occurs with. And I am fairly confident that unmitigated will occur predominantly with disaster. Right? And again, Google the word foreseeable, and I think it'll occur predominantly. If it's sort of adjective noun, it'll occur predominantly with future. Okay, where are we? Yes, another category, which is a rather interesting category, which I refer to cranberry words. Now, what are cranberry words? Do you know cranberry morpheme? No. Anyway, okay, there's a history there. The term cranberry morpheme, it goes back to the 1930s, I think. I don't know who invented the word, but it was a term used by the structuralist linguists of the 1930s in connection with morphemes. Now, morphemes, you know? Okay? So you take a word like blackberry. Blackberry consists of two morphemes, blackberry, okay? Blueberry, blueberry. So the word blue and berry are words, morphemes. But then you have a kind of berry called a cranberry. Cranberries, what are they? I think you have them here. I've seen. Can someone translate a cranberry? Little red, red berries. I've seen dried cranberries here. Americans make sort of sauce with them for their turkey. Anyway, it's a kind of red, small red berry, grows on little bushes. Now, the point of cranberry, cranberry contains the word berry, which is a morpheme, which is, okay, with meaning. Well, a cran, however, occurs only in the word cranberry. It is a morpheme. So cranberry, cranberry. Berry is a morpheme. Cran is presumably a morpheme, but it has no meaning. It doesn't occur in any other word. So a cranberry morpheme is a morpheme which occurs in one word only. And you have if you like, cranberry words, words which occur in only one construction. For example, here are some examples. I don't know whether you know this expression, by dint of. You know this one? You know this? If you don't worry. I tried this out on my native speaker students, and 60% of them didn't know the expression. So, by dint of, it means as a result of repeatedly doing something. I finally convinced him by dint of constant persuading. I finally solved this puzzle by dint of trying many times. And the point is the word dint occurs only in this expression. It has hardly any uses outside of the expression. Another one, under the auspices of, that is under the authority of, auspices is used only in this expression. Be taken aback, you should be suddenly surprised. Aback, basically, is used only in this. I was suddenly taken aback, I was suddenly surprised. And tit for tat, you insult me, I insult you, kind of thing. Okay. So, the point is, idioms are everywhere. Rather than, okay, on the dictionary plus grammar book model, language is regular and the idioms are the exceptions.
What about phraseologies?
Sorry?
Phraseologies.
Phraseologies. Phraseologies, these are rather like, phraseologies are rather like collocations. phrasal patterns. Yeah, these categories, by the way, are not, they're not distinct from each other, right? There's quite a lot of overlap, okay? So rather than say that language is basically regular and the idioms are the exceptions, in fact, once you start looking at it, the idioms start to be the rule and the regular things are the exceptions. So language is basically idiomatic and irregular, if you like. But there's one category I want to look at, and this is the constructional idiom. Okay, these are the phrasal idioms. These are the things with unusual syntax. These are the words which are used in only a fixed, a certain expression. There are quite a number of these, actually, if you start looking for them. Yeah. The cliches and so on, formulaic expressions. Now, this is where it sort of becomes interesting. You have idioms like day in, day out, day after day, you do something day in, day out, which is an idiom. But notice that the idiom is to a certain extent productive. That is to say, you can replace words in it. In other words, it's not just day in, day out, but you can also have year in, year out, year after year, week in, week out, every week. So it's almost as if the idiom is not day in, day out, but noun in, noun out, where noun is a period of time. So the idiom contains a slot, that is a position in the idiom, which can be filled by different items of the appropriate kind. So in, day out, year in, year out, week in, week out, it expresses sort of monotony, unchanging monotony. Things just go on week after week, day after day, monotonously. Okay. Another one is one by one. People came in one by one at a time. It measures the rate at which something happens, and this is actually quite productive. You translate the text word by word, word by word. Translate the text word by word. First this word, okay. Your translation progresses by looking at each word one after the other. Or you translate it page by page. First this page, then the next page. Okay? So there's a certain amount of productivity here. Right? Suppose you have a table with numbers, columns of numbers. You add up the numbers column by column, row by row. So the idiom is not so much the expression one by one, but simply noun by noun. And all sorts of nouns can be put in there. Right? So the idiom is not words as such. It's not a lexically fixed idiom, but it becomes a kind of construction with slots which can be filled. And of course the way of ending letters, yours sincerely, faithfully, hopefully, etc., etc. Things can be filled in there. Okay? Rather nice idiom is the cousin idiom, which is odd in many ways. Your cousin, what's my cousin? The cousin is the child of the brother or sister of a parent. So it's me, parent, brother, sister, child. Right? It's actually quite unusual because, as you know, English kinship, family terms, are not terribly elaborated. We don't in English make distinctions between different kinds of grandmothers, different kinds of uncles, different kinds of grandparents, and so on. So, unlike Chinese. So, English kinship terms are rather vague, but there's one aspect of kinship which is actually very, very elaborated, which is very peculiar, and this is the cousin network. So the cousin is me, parents, brother, sister, child. If I go me, parent, grandparents, so me, grandparents, grandchild, this is a very distant relation. This is my second cousin. So me, great-grandparents, great-grandchild, my third cousin. Which is very peculiar that the cousin, the cousin terminology should be so elaborated in English. And our cousins are important. So this is the first cousin. Okay, this is related to a parent. Second cousin, third cousin, fourth cousin. And the removed bit? Well, me, grandparents, me, parents, brother, sister, grandchild. This becomes a cousin once removed. It's a difference of generation. So you have an idiom which says nth cousin, n times removed, for this very elaborate cousin network, which is, as I say, very, very peculiar that the cousin network should be so elaborated in English. Many English people don't actually know this. But it's there. One possible explanation for this actually might have been that in previous times before, when people lived in small villages in the country and didn't move around a lot, before industrialization and before urbanization, when they lived in very small communities where everybody knew everybody else and actually everybody was related to everybody else, the question then arose, who are you allowed to marry? If in a very small traditional community everybody is actually related to everybody else, who can you marry? So everybody's your cousin. So you have to distinguish the close cousins and the distant cousins. Anyway. No, that's just me speculating, anyway. But now, of course, this is largely forgotten. Now, these sorts of things are referred to very often as constructional idioms. Now, constructional idioms, they are idioms in that they don't follow from very general rules. Okay, to come back to here, the day in, day out, there is a regularity there, but that is not a construction which is covered by the general rules of syntax. Okay? For the use of prepositions, for example. So they are idioms in this sense, but they are constructions in the sense that they are sort of productive. There are slots, and you can fill things in. Okay. Okay, let's continue the discussion of the idiomatic and the constructional idioms. Yeah, constructional idioms then are sort of constructions which are to some extent productive, but they are at the same time idiomatic. And here I've just put down a dozen or so of these constructional idioms. Once you start looking for them, there are thousands of them, hundreds of them. Right? Here are some constructional idioms which have been quite extensively discussed. The first one, things like, one more beer and I'm leaving. Now you can imagine a situation in which you would say that. Okay, you at a pub, at a bar, having some drinks. Now I really must get home. One more beer and I'm leaving. I'll have one more beer and then I will leave. Or give me one more beer, then I'm leaving. One more beer and I'm leaving. Now, well, okay, what is idiomatic about that? Well, what is idiomatic is the syntax, which is basically, the syntax is basically that. Noun phrase, and sentence. So one more beer, and is the lexicon, is a word there. So it coordinates a noun phrase and a sentence, which is weird, which is peculiar. There's no general grammatical rule for coordinating a noun phrase and a sentence. And yet you can do it here. And this is to some extent productive. You know, you are going home after a long journey and you might say, half an hour and we're home. Half an hour and we are home. Okay? The same sort of general pattern and the same kind of meaning. After half an hour, then I predict we will be home. Or another piece of luck like that, and I'll be rich. So again, a noun phrase, and your prediction. So this is what I mean by a constructional idiom. The syntax is very odd, but it is productive. And it's associated with a certain kind of meaning. So given the expression, one more beer and I'm leaving, you can probably work out more or less the situation in which it would be said. Okay. I'll just go through some of the more quickly than others. The more, the merrier. You know this one? The older we get, the wiser we get, or whatever. Or the less wise we get. So, two situations which are correlated. The more of this, or the less of this, the more or the less of that. So as this goes up, that goes up or down. The more we have, the more people we are, the happier we are. Right? The more, the better. The more we have, the better it is. And notice how the syntax of that is very peculiar. There's no verb, first of all. It's simply two things, the more, the more. And notice the. It doesn't actually function like a definite article at all. It's a very unusual use of the. But it is also extremely productive in that you can put in just about anything you like into, in the two slots, the. So it's a very productive, sort of open construction, but it would be governed by the, exa, the, wire. Okay. Another nice one is this: what are you doing lying on the floor? Which does not mean tell me what you are doing. It means you are lying on the floor. That is a strange thing to do. Why are you doing it? So, what are you doing lying on the floor? So, the pragmatics, the situation would be, I see that you are lying on the floor. I find that very strange. It is very unexpected. Explain. Okay? So, what's that book doing on the table? What is that book doing on the table? Why is it there? Or, you know, the joke in the restaurant, waiter, what is this fly doing in my soup? And the waiter says, I think it's trying to swim. Okay. The point there, of course, is that the idiom is taken idiomatically and literally. What is the fly doing in my soup? It is trying to swim. That is the literal interpretation. But what is meant, what is this fly doing in my soup? Explain. Okay? So again, this is a very productive construction. And it will be something like that would be, oops, that would be more or less how you would sort of describe the construction. The fixed parts of the construction would be what do, what and do. X and Y are slots which can be filled in by all sorts of things. So what is this book doing on the table? What is this book doing on the floor? What are you doing lying on the floor? What is the fly doing in my soup? And as you can see, you can fill in X and Y by just about everything. Not everything, by lots of things, provided the sort of semantics is appropriate. You could even say something like, what's it doing raining today? It's a bit odd, but the situation would be, the weather forecast said it will be fine and sunny today, but what's it doing raining? So the situation is quite strange. I didn't expect it. What is the explanation for this? Or I'm surprised at the situation. Okay? Now, the point is something like that. It's rather like a syntactic rule. It's rather like one of your rules, but it's a rather special kind of rule in that it is associated with a very special kind of semantics and pragmatics even. So here you see the difference then between the idiomatic and the regular is not actually clear-cut. That is a sort of syntactic rule, but it's not what you would normally think of as a rule. It's not like one of those rules that I mentioned right at the beginning, the dictionary plus grammar book thing. It's not one of the rules you find in the grammar book. And here are a few more of these things. I can maybe go through these fairly quickly. Let's see, what do we have? Yes. Yeah, the more the merrier. What are you doing, Langford? What? Me write a novel? Can you work out the meaning of that? What? Me write a novel? Yes. If you try to put that in a context, interestingly, even if you have never come across this, you might actually be able to guess the meaning, which is interesting. The situation would be in the middle of a conversation, somebody has suggested or brought up or mentioned the possibility of me writing a novel, or suggested or maybe thinks that I have written a novel. So the idea of me writing a novel has been brought up in the conversation, and I comment on that. What? Me write a novel? You must be joking. So you take up some idea which has been mentioned already, and then you dismiss this as absurd, silly, out of the question. Okay, notice first of all, it has to be spoken with a certain intonation. Me, write a novel. And notice also the funny syntax. Me, write a novel. It looks like a subject-verb-object clause, a regular sentence, subject, predicate, subject, verb, object. But notice, however, that the verb is the bare infinitive, and the subject is not I, but me. And if you replace me with him, what? Him. It is him write a novel without the S on the end. So it's not him writes a novel, but him write a novel. In other words, it looks like a sentence, subject, verb, but there is no tense, no agreement, and the subject is not I, he, but me, him. Okay? So it's a very funny syntax from that point of view. But as you can appreciate, this particular construction is very, very, very productive in the sense that you can put in just about any items you like. You can put for the me, you can replace it by any noun phrase, by anybody, and write a novel, you can replace that by just about any verb phrase. So it's almost as productive as your standard phrase structure rule, you know, S, your sentence is noun phrase plus verb phrase. Well, that's what, well, noun phrase, verb phrase, yes, but noun phrase is accusative case, verb phrase doesn't have tense or inflection. So that is a very, and also the other point is it is associated with a very specific semantics and pragmatics. There are certain circumstances in which you say it. So it's associated with a very specific context. Okay, a few more. Not in my house, you won't. He may be a professor, but he sure is dumb. You get that one? It may be true. I agree. You know, it is the case that he is a professor, but I state that he is stupid. He may be, but he sure is dumb. Some of these I maybe will talk about in more detail later. He lied his way through the interview. Do you understand that one? It's very idiomatic English, in that I imagine it will be quite difficult to translate into just about any other language. I don't know how it goes into Chinese. But the point is, what does it mean? You are having an interview. You are being interviewed for a job or position or something. And you get through the interview successfully by telling lies. Okay? So you are being interviewed for a job, people ask you questions, and you just tell lies about all your previous experience and qualifications and so on. So you get through the interview successfully by lying. The point about that is, notice that his way, syntactically that is the direct object of to lie. He lied his way, subject, verb, object. Right? But lie, in the sense of to tell lies, is not a transitive verb. Right? So you have the construction. This is often referred to as the way construction because the fixed part, the fixed item, is what way. And it is very productive in that you can replace the items by all sorts of different things. For example, you can, well, the simplest case with things like I make my way to the exit. I make my way to the exit. Or I push my way to the exit. I elbow my way to the exit. And you could have other metaphor, other things which involve not actually motion. Things like the government spends its way out of recession. Right, you achieve, as you get through the interview by telling lies. Okay. Bang goes my weekend. Do you know that one? Again, if you don't know it, you can perhaps guess the meaning. I'm going to talk about this in much more detail, probably this afternoon, actually. The situation would be, I have plans for the weekend, and they get spoiled. That's the end of my plans for the weekend. Okay? Day in, day out, we've looked at not even X, let alone Y. So you are, here's two things are sort of graded. One is more difficult or more unlikely than the other. So an example would be he can't even speak, he can't even read English, let alone speak it. So I can't do this, let alone that. So if you can't do this, it follows that you can't do that. Let alone is the critical part of the idiom. The cynic in me, or the optimist in me, the pessimist in me, the realist in me would say, that's an interesting one because it sort of implies that there are different sort of people inside you. That there's a little cynical person inside me, there's an optimist inside me, there's a pessimist inside me, there's a realist inside me. So the cynic in me, the pessimist in me would say, but the optimist in me would say, it doesn't mean go and prove me wrong, it means just prove me wrong. I am right, you go and prove me wrong. Idiomatic use of go and. Okay, the point is, there are hundreds of these things. These constructional idioms, which are idiomatic and productive. Question arises, actually, is once you start looking at these constructional idioms, they threaten to take over the whole language, in fact. Once you start looking at these things and looking for these things, maybe this is what the grammar is, simply a whole list of constructional idioms. But if you compare number 4, what me, write a novel, what is the difference between that and I wrote a novel? The only difference is that me, write a novel, has rather special semantics, rather special pragmatics. But there's actually no difference in status as, you know, a construction in the language. So the picture that emerges then perhaps is that the grammar of a language consists of idioms which, or rather constructions and so on, which vary between the extremely idiomatic on the one hand and the extremely productive on the other. The extremely idiomatic would be by and large, which is a unique expression, right? You can't replace anything in it. On the other hand, you have the fully productive things like I wrote a novel, and all these other things sort of in between. And another point to make is that many of these constructional idioms make reference to specific words. So you can see the relation between words and constructions as a kind of two-way one. To describe a construction, you often have to make reference to the kinds of words that occur in it. For example, the day in, day out construction. The noun has to be a period of time. So the construction makes reference to the words that occur in it. The other way around, to describe a word, you refer to the constructions in which it can occur. Okay? So, the word weigh, one aspect of the verb weigh is the fact that it occurs in this weigh construction. Many other uses, but that is one of the uses. So, simplifying somewhat, or putting it rather in extreme form, to know a word is to know the constructions it can occur in. to know a construction is to know the words that can occur in it. So two sides to the same issue. Okay, now this actually, let me see. This actually might be a good place for me to go back to what we did yesterday, actually, because yesterday's lecture was incomplete. There was something I missed out at the end. Let's go back to that, because this would sort of to recapitulate. Yesterday we spoke about categorization and about Q validity and so on. Okay, let me see where are we. Okay, the basic notion is this. If you think, okay, this would seem initially to be a sudden change of topic, right? But we'll see how it links up in a moment. If you think of a category such as bird, okay, and members of the category like sparrows and penguins and eagles and so on, if an entity E has property P, what is the probability that that entity is a member of the category? In other words, if some creature flies, what is the probability that it's a bird? Well, a bit of mathematics there. The total number of things that fly and the total number of flying birds, it's a ratio of the total number of things that fly and the total number of birds that fly. Okay, well, we can't do the mathematics there as we don't know how many things that fly. But anyway, if something flies, we can say intuitively there's a pretty good chance that it's a bird. It need not be, it could be an aeroplane. Right? They also fly. But if you learn that something flies, there's a pretty good chance it could be a bird. Right? The flying has high Q validity for categorization as a bird. But if you learn that something has a liver, what is the probability that it's a bird? Notice that all birds do indeed have a liver, but they'll do countless other things. So intuitively we would say that the probability is very, very low. Given this fact, you can't really predict the category. Now you can turn this round and say, if you know that this thing belongs in the category, if you know that this thing is a bird, to what extent can you predict that it will fly? Again, the arithmetic would be quite simple. How many birds are there that fly and how many birds are there that don't fly? But if it's a bird, what is the probability that it will fly? Well, quite high, but not 100%, because there are penguins which don't fly. Now, what's that got to do with syntax? These notions can be applied to syntax. Let us say that the construction is the category and that the words that occur in it are the features or the properties. So the question then becomes, given that a certain word is used, can you predict the construction it's going to be used in? Other way around, given that a certain construction is used, can you predict the word that will occur in it? Okay? And there are lots of possibilities here. Here are some of them. Given that the sentence is a ditransitive clause, ditransitive, a sentence with two objects, subject, verb, object, object. Like buy me a present. Right? To what extent can you predict which verb will occur in the construction? Well, in fact, a reasonable guess is that the verb is one of three verbs, namely give, send, and tell. Give the child a present, send somebody a parcel, tell me the story. There are lots of other verbs which take these two objects, but give, send, and tell are the most common ones. So if you know that something is a ditransitive, if you hear verb, object, object, it's a pretty good guess that it's one of send, tell, or give. Okay? Now, putting it the other way, given if the verb give occurs in a sentence, how confident can you be that it will be followed by two objects? Well, actually, pretty confident, actually. Most uses of the verb to give are, in fact, to give somebody something. Right? Actually, very confident, maybe that should be fairly confident, actually. Now, we can apply this actually to the sort of stuff I've been mentioning already. Just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay. The data I'm going to give are taken from the British National Corpus, which I mentioned yesterday. This is a corpus of 100 million words of basically British English, taken to be representative of the language, compiled in about 10 years ago, actually, from various sources, written, spoken, narrative, journalistic, and so on. So a corpus of 100 million words, which is now extensively used for linguistic research. It's available, actually, on these websites. The first one, you can sample it. You get 50 examples of a word. This next one, you get in it by the back door, actually. You can actually you can access quite a few of the properties of the British National Corpus. So far, maybe if millions of people start accessing it, it won't be available anymore. Anyway, but this is the British National Corpus. To have full access to it, you've got to pay for your subscription, unfortunately. But you can actually get quite a lot of data from the British National Corpus using these things. Can I move on? Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so with this in mind, I did some numbers, got some numbers from the British National Corpus. I looked at the word dint. The word dint occurs 73 times in the 100 million. The expression by dint of occurs 67 times. So you see, 92% of all occurrences of the word dint are in the context of by dint of. So given the word dint, you can be pretty confident of the context. And actually, those remaining 8% of cases, when I looked at them, it looked to me as if it was a mistake, actually. People were using dint as if it was dent. Put a dint in your car when it should be dent. So a bit of confusion there, anyway. Another thing where it goes the opposite way around. Do you know the expression, it was an accident waiting to happen? Anyway, you do now. So the situation, this is a critical situation, we must do something about it, it's an accident waiting to happen. If you don't do anything, there'll be an accident. Now, waiting to happen, that expression, waiting to happen, occurs 35 times. It was an accident waiting to happen occurs 14 times. It was a disaster waiting to happen occurs 11 times. So you see, 25, well, it's about, what, a third, 2/3 of all cases of waiting to happen are associated with the words accident and disaster. So given it was waiting to happen, it's accident or disaster. It could be lots of other things, but those are the expected ones. And notice of the two words accident and disaster, accident occurs 3 times more frequently than disaster. So the association between disaster and waiting to happen is in fact stronger. Okay? So there you see a rather nice, interlocking, of the construction and the words in the construction. Now, in fact, you can apply this to other things. If you take a simple thing like the past tense of a verb, all verbs have a past tense, okay? Well, just about. All verbs can occur in the present tense or the past tense. But some verbs are more likely to occur in the past tense than others. For example, say, said, is more likely to occur in the past tense than think. For obvious reasons, actually. So even for something like the past tense form of a verb, that form is actually, so the past tense morphology is associated with certain verbs rather than other verbs. So even on such a basic level as that, a basic thing as that, construction and morpheme, there are associations. All count nouns can occur in the plural, but some nouns are more likely to occur in the plural. I think for obvious reasons, the word I is more likely to occur in the plural than mouth. And indeed it does. You can check it out in the BNC. The ratio of I versus eyes versus mouth versus mouths. So it's not the case that these rules for making past tense, plural, or whatever apply across the board. There are these associations, preferences, which are sort of statistical in nature, but the statistical character is actually very, very regular and extraordinarily regular, in fact. And this is, I'll just finish off with this here. Okay, so you wouldn't think of of as a construction, perhaps. It's a sort of phraseology, actually. So, of, very common words, of. Now, if you take that of, what are the words that are likely to occur in it? Well, in fact, the possibility, well, an enormous number of possibilities. An enormous number of words could occur in it. But these are some of the... Okay, now, there are 154,000 occurrences of that in the British National Corpus. It was quite a lot, actually, 154,000 out of 100 million. So it's quite a common combination of words. The most frequent one is a number of, and here are the actual numbers, 15,000, a lot of, a couple of, a series of, a result of, a bit of, a matter of, and so on. And then as you go down, the frequency gets less and less. So you see that couple is the third most likely word to occur in the phraseology, in the construction. So if you look at the word couple as a noun, the word couple as a noun, the NN1, that's the code you put in for the corpus search, it means a noun singular. So the number of occurrences of couple as a noun is 11,270 in the corpus, but a couple of occurs 7,071. And you see that basically 2/3 of all occurrences of the word couple occur in this context, right? Which is quite large. I mean, it's 63%. So there you have a quite nice illustration of, again, the relation between construction and word. So given the word couple as a noun occurs, there's a 63% chance that it's in the context a couple of. Right? Given the expression a of, the third most likely word to occur there is couple. Right? So it's a two-way thing, you see. The one predicts the other. Of course, there are lots of possibilities. Okay, lot is the second most frequent. Looking at lot, it's again 62%. So given the word lot, the probability that the construction is used is about the same. Pair, no. Pair is quite, as a noun, is not so frequent, but a 40% chance that pair occurs in the pair of. A pinch, like a pinch of salt, actually much lower. That's about a 23% chance. Swarm is interesting. You know, a swarm of bees. The bees swarming. Okay. A swarm of occurs 44 times. The noun swarm occurs 79 times, but a swarm occurs 48 times. So given that a swarm occurs, 92% chance it's going to be a swarm of. So there you have a case where the word is very closely associated with the construction. Even though the absolute numbers here are very, very small, swarm is not a frequent word. Okay? 78 cases. So, yeah, 79 examples. It's not a frequent word. But if it occurs, it's going to occur probably in this particular construction, like a swarm of bees. Okay? So with swarm, the association is very strong. With couple and lot, which are very frequent words, as you can see, the association is equally strong. With a pair of, the association is not so strong. You can use pair in all sorts of other contexts. Okay, now what I basically mentioned this because coming back to a thing I said yesterday, cognitive linguistics is usage-based, and one of the trends nowadays is, in fact, to study usage on the basis of, well, usage, on the basis of corpus data. And one thing I can sort of recommend as a rich source of data on English and indeed on any language is, in fact, corpus research. So the corpus is an absolutely essential research tool nowadays. And if you don't have access to the corpus, you can Google always. And in fact, Googling is necessary for cases, for expressions which are, in fact, very infrequent. Let's say 100 million words is a lot of words. But still, there are things which you don't find in the British National Corpus. They're so infrequent. For those, to get their properties, you have to start Googling. Right? For example, the idiom which we discussed, I mentioned, the cynic in me would say, you don't find that in the British National Corpus. Although if you Google, you'll find lots of examples. Right? Okay, so I think that's it for this morning, at least. This afternoon, I'll say more about constructions and the way in which things are all sort of interrelated and so on. And also questions this afternoon.